No empire in history ever admitted it was collapsing while it was collapsing. Rome believed it was eternal until its final days. Britain thought it was still the center of the world, even as its empire was falling apart. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it possessed the largest army on Earth. And they all said the same sentence: "We are different." But what if this time really is different? Empires are usually told to us through wars, glorious victories, dramatic defeats, sudden collapses. But empires do not actually collapse in a single day. The real collapse always begins in the accounting books. One thing is certain: every empire collapses without exception. No matter how long it ruled or how much land it controlled, this outcome is inevitable. Spain, once the richest empire in the world; Britain, which governed the largest empire in human history in 1914; Rome, which ruled for more than 1,000 years; the Ottoman Empire, whose lands stretched across continents; and the Soviet Union, armed with nuclear weapons and satellites covering the globe. All of them collapsed. So today, is the United States walking down the same path as the empires before it? Welcome to Code 404, Economy, where the historical codes of money are revealed. The truth is always hidden in the details. Contrary to popular belief, empires do not collapse because of wars or invading armies at the gates. Collapse is always caused by money and bad economics. History tells us this. An empire goes beyond self-sufficiency. Military bases in foreign countries, wars fought on multiple fronts, promises that cannot be fulfilled, debts that can never be repaid. At first, there's no sense of stagnation or decline. The currency still functions. Armies return victorious from war. Governments continue making promises. But invisible cracks are spreading beneath the surface. Resources are misallocated. Productive capacity declines. Bright minds leave. Then acceleration begins. The currency loses value. Reserve currency status erodes. Trade partners begin searching for alternatives. Enemies, sensing weakness, start pushing at the gates. The very elements that once created power suddenly turn into weaknesses. A currency once demanded by everyone is no longer wanted. The army can no longer be funded and becomes immobile. Promises can no longer be kept. This is not speculation or theoretical fiction. These are historical realities experienced by great empires and superpowers. This is what happened to Rome, Spain, the Ottoman Empire, Britain, and the Soviet Union. It happened because they believed their power was endless. They all made the same flawed decisions. They overextended militarily. They devalued their currencies. And even when collapse had already begun, they refused to accept reality. Let's examine how this happened, and look closely at the current situation of the United States. Let's start with the Roman Empire. They ruled the lives of millions of people. The remnants of their great rule still stand in cities across the world. Rome possessed one of the most advanced administrative systems humanity had ever seen. Roads, law, army, taxation, everything worked. Yet after centuries of dominance, Rome collapsed. The collapse did not happen overnight. Expansion and advancement were expensive. As borders expanded, needs multiplied and military costs increased. To generate resources, taxes were raised. But taxes could not be increased indefinitely, so they chose to debase their currency. Coins with reduced silver content temporarily eased the system, but in the long run, they destroyed trust. Rome also failed to solve its production problems. They struggled with shortages and peasant revolts. Each time they bought time by further devaluing the currency. But this marked the beginning of the end. This was not an exception. It was a template. Rome was not destroyed by barbarians. Rome lost control of its accounting. Centuries later, the Spanish Empire repeated the same mistake. After the discovery of the Americas, gold and silver flowing from the New World turned Spain into a global power. They controlled Europe's money supply. The Spanish real became a global reserve currency. Everyone wanted Spanish silver. Spain was fighting wars on multiple fronts simultaneously. War costs reached staggering levels. Against the Ottomans, France and Italy in the Mediterranean, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, against the British Navy, and in endless conflicts across the Americas. By the late 16th century, the cost of Spain's global military commitments was devastating. Nearly half of state revenues went to military spending. Taxes eventually became insufficient. As every failing empire does, Spain chose to debase its currency. The silver content of coins was reduced. The result was an inflation explosion. The artificial wealth created by New World gold and silver disconnected Spain from production. Easy money replaced difficult reforms. Debt grew. Revenues could no longer cover interest payments. Debt was used to pay debt. Eventually, the debts became unpayable and default followed. Spain defaulted 4 times in 40 years. It was the most powerful empire of its era, until it could no longer finance its power. When we reach the British Empire, the picture becomes more familiar. Britain, in the early 1900s, was the empire on which the sun never set. The British pound was the global reserve currency. London was the financial center of the world. They believed their power was inexhaustible. They had military commitments everywhere: India, Africa, the Middle East, China, the Pacific, the Caribbean. The costs were enormous. Then World War I arrived. They won the war, but they borrowed heavily. They borrowed from everyone, mostly from the United States. Gold reserves were depleted. They tried to defend the value of the pound, but failed. Britain abandoned the gold standard, and the pound lost 25% of its value overnight. The global currency could no longer keep its promises. Before World War I, debts were repaid. World War II arrived. The result was even more borrowing. The end of the empire was approaching. In 1947, Britain gave up India. Within the next 20 years, it lost everything else. The pound lost its reserve currency status. The global order changed. Britain still existed, but the empire was gone. Power no longer resided in Britain. Because global leadership is not free. They won the wars, but could not pay the bill. And the Soviet Union. After World War II, it emerged as a superpower. Nuclear weapons, satellites in space, military control over Eastern Europe. They believed they owned the future. Communism would erase capitalism. They competed with the United States for 45 years. They tried to do more of everything. But deep down, they failed to realize that the economy was dying. Contrary to popular belief, the Soviet Union did not collapse for ideological reasons. It collapsed because it failed to confront economic realities: planning errors, inefficiency, excessive borrowing, and dependence on a single revenue source. Oil income was used to cover problems, but they were never fully solved. There was power, there were weapons, but there was no sustainability. When the Berlin Wall fell, the empire began to unravel. Eastern European states declared independence, trade networks collapsed, gold reserves melted away day by day. Lacking production, the Soviet Union burned tons of gold just to import grain. Eventually, the army could no longer be paid. There was no war, no invasion, but the economy imploded from within. When the money ran out, the empire ended. The weapons still existed, but the economy was gone. When we place all these examples side by side, the stages of collapse follow the same path: overexpansion, currency debasement, debt, and eventual collapse. Truthfully, the United States today appears to be on the same path. Let's examine this. But first, we must answer one question. Why do empires always display the same economic reflexes? The answer is simple: because power makes mistakes invisible, and invisible mistakes cannot be corrected. Rome, Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union were all very different. They existed in different eras. They had different ideologies. They used different technologies. Yet, after reaching their peak, they all exhibited similar economic behavior. As empires expand, they grow stronger, but costs rise at the same time. In Rome, the cost came from frontier armies. In Spain, from navies and colonial defense. In Britain, from protecting global trade routes. In the Soviet Union, from financing satellite states. Expansion is profitable at first, but eventually the cost of maintaining power exceeds the benefit. Once this threshold is crossed, the system faces three options: retreat, reform, borrow. History shows us that empires almost always choose the third option. Debt is an empire's favorite tool, because it is invisible. It does not demand immediate payment. Its political cost is low. Rome debased its currency. Spain borrowed. Britain financed wars with credit. The Soviet Union relied on energy revenues and external debt. None of them used debt for structural reform. Debt was used to maintain the existing system. At this point, debt ceases to be a tool. It becomes a habit. Another common imperial reflex is buying time with money. In Rome, this meant debasing currency. In Spain, abundant gold. In Britain, reserve currency privilege. In the Soviet Union, oil revenues. Time was bought. But reform was never made. And time was always used the same way: to postpone problems. In the final stages of empires, a common pattern emerges. Official figures look good. There is growth. The sense of power remains. But daily life becomes harder for the population. In Rome, taxes increased. In Spain, inflation rose. In Britain, the welfare state became unsustainable. In the Soviet Union, shelves were empty. When this disconnect begins, the system faces not only an economic crisis, but a legitimacy crisis as well. Empires usually fall into the same illusion. We are different. Rome believed it was eternal. Spain believed it had a divine mission. Britain believed it was spreading civilization. The Soviet Union believed history was on its side. This belief turns criticism into weakness. Warnings are silenced. But history does not respect power. It respects sustainability. So where does the United States stand in this picture? Today, the United States is at a point very few empires in history ever reached. It has hundreds of military bases across nearly 80 countries. Its military budget approaches $900 billion. The dollar is the global reserve currency. It sits at the center of the financial system. All of this brings advantages, that is true, but it also creates a dangerous comfort. Advantages delay reform, hide costs, and distort risk perception. Today, the United States finances expansion with debt, relies on financial growth rather than real production, treats structural problems as temporary. This places it on the same trajectory as previous empires. History shows us this clearly. Empires are not destroyed by enemies or wars. They are destroyed by their own economic reflexes. Up to this point, one might conclude, so the United States will inevitably collapse. But history is not that mechanical. Every empire makes similar mistakes, but none fall at the same speed or in the same way. There are critical differences that separate the United States from Rome, Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Any analysis that ignores these differences is incomplete. The first is institutional flexibility. Rome was rigid. The Soviet Union was even more rigid. The United States, however, has historically responded to crises with institutional adaptability. The Great Depression of 1929, the stagflation of the 1970s, the financial crisis of 2008. Each time, the system was shaken, but it never fully froze. This flexibility is America's greatest strength, but it also carries a risk, the habit of seeing problems as permanently manageable. Another difference is innovation and productivity capacity. Rome grew through conquest, Spain through mining, Britain through trade, the Soviet Union through military power. The United States grew through technology. This is a crucial distinction. True innovation is something debt cannot create. The United States still leads the world in technology, software, defense, biotechnology. This remains the core force keeping the system alive. But the question is unavoidable. How long can innovation offset structural debt problems? Another difference is reserve currency privilege. No empire before the United States possessed such a financial advantage. The dollar is the language of global trade, the unit of debt, the safe haven in times of crisis. This buys the United States time, more time than any empire before it. But history shows us one thing clearly. Reserve currency status is not permanent. The pound experienced this. Another difference lies in social diversity and migration dynamics. In Rome's final years, population declined. In the Soviet Union, brain drain accelerated. The United States still attracts talent. This is a silent force feeding the system, but it is not infinite. If social tensions rise, this dynamic can reverse. America's differences also represent the potential to avoid collapse. But when mismanaged, those same differences can deepen it. Because advantages delay reform, hide the true cost, distort risk perception. History tells us this. The empires that fall the latest often experience the harshest awakening. We have now reached a clear conclusion. The United States is not a direct copy of past empires, but it is repeating their mistakes, hiding them behind more complex tools. It has begun to display the same economic reflexes, and while these reflexes provide temporary solutions, they have never protected any empire in the long run. History teaches us this clearly. Empires do not collapse in a single day. Collapse is not a moment, but a process. When Rome fell, people did not wake up the next day and say, "The empire has collapsed." Markets were still open, soldiers were still in uniform, taxes were still being collected. But three things had changed. One, the future had become more uncertain. Two, prosperity was no longer permanent. Three, the system had begun postponing problems instead of solving them. This is the true definition of collapse. So, does the United States fit this definition today? Let's ask the questions honestly. Has debt overtaken economic growth? Are political decisions long-term or election-driven? Is production being discussed or financial illusions? Is the middle class shrinking? Is the younger generation more pessimistic than the previous one? The answers to most of these questions are the same in every empire that has collapsed. History does not offer a single future. It offers possibilities. For the United States, there are three realistic scenarios. Scenario 1, controlled slowdown. This is the most optimistic scenario. Debt growth slows. Global power sharing is accepted. The United States remains strong, but no longer the sole superpower. This mirrors Britain's experience. The empire ends, the state continues. Scenario 2, prolonged stagnation. This most closely resembles late-stage Rome. The economy technically grows, but the population becomes poorer. Income inequality increases. Political polarization becomes permanent. There is no collapse, but there is no progress either. This is decay from within. Scenario 3, financial rupture. The harshest but least discussed possibility. The dollar loses trust. Debt becomes unsustainable. The global financial system is shaken. This scenario may appear sudden, like the Soviet collapse, but behind it lies decades of accumulated mistakes. History tells us this: empires do not collapse overnight. First, they deny, then they borrow, then they adapt, and finally, they face a reality they can no longer pay for. This video does not claim the United States will collapse tomorrow. This video says the United States has entered the same path walked by every empire that eventually collapsed. The mistakes of past empires did not remain in the past. The real question is not whether history will repeat itself today, but whether the warning will be taken seriously. And if that warning is ignored, history shows us one thing clearly: if the path does not change, the outcome will not change. History does not give empires a second chance. It only offers a later day of reckoning. If this video gave you a new perspective, subscribe. The answers are hidden in history's codes. We reveal them.